Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on key battles in the Revolutionary War. In the last episode, covering Bunker Hill, we saw that both sides realized this is not going to be a short conflict. Early on, the British hoped that they could crush the rebels decisively once and for all. The Patriots, or the Proto-Americans, whatever you want to call them, were less optimistic that this thing could be done over with quickly because I knew the British wouldn't back down. But as higher-ups in the British Army are coming to the colonies, things are getting down to business, and tiny little skirmishes that are noteworthy but not really that big in scale. We're getting past that, and now we're really getting into the big guns. So, James, ready to take out the large bayonets and affix them to our muskets?
Yes, let's do that.
All right, let's bayonet fence.
Charge. We're moving on to key battle number 3. Really more a campaign than a single battle. Seldom will we actually just do one battle. We're always going to give you the lead up to it and then the aftermath, and sometimes there will be some minor battles in between. This is one that not a lot of people know about, even people who have taken some history. I started to say, Scott, the man on the street, but if you stop the man on the street and start asking him history questions, forget it.
Yeah.
The average man on the street or woman on the street knows next to nothing. So even if let's say you took somebody who was a history major and just had an undergrad, let's say, they may not know about this, or at least not much. I mean, a lot of people know about Bunker Hill, Lexington and Concord, Saratoga, Yorktown, certainly. But we're going to talk about the American attempt to take over Canada, specifically the attack on the fortress city of Quebec. But before we get there, we left off after Bunker Hill last time. Let's talk a little bit more about the reaction to Bunker Hill on both sides. We touched on a little bit of the reaction last time, but we want to go into more detail. So, again, Bunker Hill was a very bloody battle. For the British, it's going to be the bloodiest battle of the entire war. Of course, they don't know that at the time. They can't, obviously they don't have foresight, and they can't say, "Oh, well, we got smushed here. we lost too many people." But that's okay. Every other battle will be less. So it really it's a wake-up call for the British, even though technically it was a British victory in that they drove the Americans from the field and completely off the Charlestown Peninsula. Nevertheless, the carnage shocked battle-hardened veterans as well as rookies. Now, the Second Continental Congress, and from now on, we're just going to call them Congress. It's much shorter, and the Second Continental Congress for several years is going to be the actual government of the United States of America. It will be supplemented by the Confederation Congress later, so we'll just call it Congress. They greeted the news of Bunker Hill with jubilation. Again, there was a sense that, hey, we can actually fight. We're not that bad after all. And if we'd had more ammo, and if we had a little bit more training, and perhaps if we'd stayed on Breeds Hill like we were supposed to. I mean, I'm sorry, I always mix that up, Scott. If we had stayed on Bunker Hill, they were supposed to be on Bunker Hill, but instead they moved to Breeds Hill.
If people had named it the right way, it wouldn't be a problem, so it's not your fault.
Oh, well, I mix that up almost every time. On July 6th, not too long after the battle, Congress produced a document. And this, by the way, this is 1775, everyone. So don't think, 2 days after the 4th of July. I mean, yes, in one sense it was, but this is not the 4th of July. That'll be later. Anyway, on July 6, 1775, Congress produced a document called the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. It was written by John Dickinson from Pennsylvania. But Dickinson used an earlier draft written by Thomas Jefferson. I believe, Scott, this is the first time his name has popped up, at least officially. Jefferson, in writing that, even though it was revised by John Dickinson, Jefferson is developing a reputation for being a really good writer. So remember that, folks. There's a little foreshadowing for you. Thomas Jefferson, good writer. All right, so in this Declaration of Causes, the Congress said, "We fight not for glory or conquest, and we mean not to dissolve that union with Britain that has so happily existed between us." Okay, so they're saying specifically, we don't want to dissolve the union. We don't want to break apart from Britain. We're just fighting for our rights. What a difference a year's going to make, huh?
Yeah, wow.
But they go on to state that they were resolved to die free men rather than to live as slaves. And there's some irony there in a lot of these delegates to Congress are Southerners who own slaves, and they're saying that Britain has made them into slaves. But I think we'll table that discussion for now, if that's okay, Scott. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. So here they're justifying what they've done. At the same time, roughly a couple days later, on July 8th, they send a document that comes to be known as the Olive Branch Petition. It's written also by John Dickinson, and it's written specifically to the king, addressed to King George III. This document stated that the colonists would end their armed rebellion if the king would withdraw British military forces from the colonies and revoke the Intolerable Acts that we talked about way back in our first episode. And not everybody was really wild about the idea of even writing this and sending it. For example, John Adams and other pro-independence delegates, Samuel Adams, others, they thought the Olive Branch Petition was a waste of time. But we will see what happens when the king gets it a little bit later. Scott, you wanted to say something about John Dickinson?
Yeah, I just want to mention a little about him. I won't stray too far off because this is a military history podcast, but I think Dickinson is a good avatar for the more conservative view that's going on, so you can see what is the climate as people are fighting these battles. So Dickinson is sort of, I don't want to say a second-tier founding father. He's second-tier in the sense that his name simply isn't as well known. That would include the likes of George Mason, John Marshall, Francis Marion, some other different people too. Henry Lee. We'll meet these different characters later on.
Richard Henry Lee, Joseph Warren, who was killed at Bunker Hill. Yeah, there's a lot of those.
John Carroll and
yeah, they did a lot, but they just didn't really make the cut into the survey courses, you know?
Yeah, so I recommend Brian McClanahan. He has a podcast. He's a very much an originalist in his constitutional thoughts, but he can dig into all sorts of things on the founding fathers. So anyway, what I want to mention with Dickinson, he's called the conservative revolutionary, and I don't mean conservative in the contemporary sense, but in that he wants to conserve the old order and make changes, not radically, but more incrementally. But he was a pamphleteer who is a key figure in the colonies at almost every stage, from the first stirrings of independence, from the Stamped Act in Congress in 1765, all the way up to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He's a governor of both states in Pennsylvania and Delaware. He's a very well-known political figure in both those areas. He frames the Articles of Confederation. He has heavy influence on the Constitution as well. But like what you mentioned, James, even up to a year later, Dickinson is still hoping for conciliation between Britain and the colonies. Am I going to spoil anything by saying how he votes on the Constitution?
The Declaration?
Declaration, yeah, sorry. He votes against it, and the vote is by states and not delegates, but he made a resounding speech talking against it, and that he doesn't oppose independence in principle, but he didn't believe that the colonies were ready for war against England, that, well, we don't have any foreign alliances, and we don't have a plan yet for a stronger union. So later on, he said that it was the timing and not the idea of independence that led him to vote no. And after he retires from Congress, after his vote, he does take up arms against the British as a brigadier general in the Pennsylvania militia. But before leaving in July 1776, he drafted a plan called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And this influences some of the early governing documents of the United States. So just want to mention Dickinson as some of these different voices. The founding fathers are never, ever speaking with one clear voice on anything. And I think Dickinson is a good representation of more conservative approach to politics.
Yeah, all right, definitely. So let's see what the reaction to Bunker Hill was, and on the other side of the pond. So we talked about the Olive Branch Petition. It was written by John Dickinson and endorsed by Congress, at least for the most people in Congress. It was sent to King George, and King George got it. He opened it, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's really reasonable. Sure, no problem. I'll just do everything you say, colonists. I'll get rid of the army. I'll get rid of the Intolerable Acts. No problem." I'm lying, by the way. Of course, everybody does.
Nope.
Yeah. He rejected it soundly. He did the exact opposite of what I just said. The British Prime Minister was named Lord North, and North told the king the rebellion should be treated as a foreign war. And the king issued a proclamation saying, in essence, that the gloves had to come off. In other words, far from giving in to the demands of these rebels, I'm going to crack down, I'm going to crush this rebellion. Parliament passed an act prohibiting trade and commerce with Europe from the colonies. All American ships were subject to capture and confiscation. So things are getting heated here. They're getting ugly. John Adams, always good for a quote, right? John Adams, in our Civil War series, it was always William T. Sherman. He was the king of the great pithy quote. Well, John Adams is not pithy. John Adams
not at all. George Washington is pithy.
He was never called a man of few words. That would be George Washington, but Adams was a man of many words, but he often had very interesting things to say. He wrote this. He said, King, lords, and commons have united in sundering this country from that, I think, forever. It is a complete dismemberment of the British Empire. It makes us independent in spite of our supplications and entreaties. So in other words, he's saying, number one, this is the king and the British government's fault. And number two, basically, we're already independent for all intents and purposes. You know, in this time period between now and 1776, I should mention that most of the colonies are already forming separate governments. They're the royal governors, the ones that are still around, they don't really have much authority, if any. Sometimes it's just limited to one city. And the colonists are setting up rival governments. We'll call them patriot governments and legislatures and things like that. So we're definitely starting to move in the direction of independence. But it's going to be a little while before it becomes official. Okay, so the British Army, let's talk about that. We talked in detail about what an individual British soldier was like in a previous episode, but now let's look at the top level. Let's go up at 30,000 feet, so to speak. The British Army only had about 38,000 people, soldiers, and the Navy only had about 18,000 sailors. And they only had 29 ships in North America, only 3 of which were ships of the line. Okay, and I don't want to go into too much detail about the different kinds of ships, but a ship of the line is a term we'll use again and again, and that is the best kind of warship there was at the time. It's a ship that has lots of guns. You know, sometimes I don't know what the minimum requirement is for it to be considered a ship of the line. 50 or something like that, but I'm not an expert on naval combat, but 50, 60, 70. Some of them, we're going to see one later toward the end of the series that has 100 guns. You know, that's just amazing. So these are basically battleships. They didn't call them battleships, but these are the 18th century equivalent of battleships, the biggest, most powerful ships, but they only had 3. And a lot of the Army and Navy were needed in other parts of the world. So obviously, Britain is in the process of building a vast overseas empire, and they have more to think about than just the American colonies. There's other colonies as well. In fact, the colonies they had in the Caribbean were much more valuable financially. They made a lot more money for Britain than the North American colonies. So even though, yes, the British Army was one of the best, if not the best in the world, and definitely the best Navy in the world, it's not like they could just send over an unlimited number of soldiers and sailors. So that's going to be a challenge for them.
That's a good thing to keep in mind when we consider the actions of British High Command, because sometimes it seems they're not doing enough. Later on in the war, you'll see something that I've heard one professor describe as a surge, similar to 2007 with U.S. forces in Iraq, to try to ramp up forces to quickly knock out the Revolutionary War, because Britain has concerns in its other colonies. You mentioned the Caribbean, but now they're setting up colonies in Canada, the West Indies, New Zealand. This is shortly after Captain James Cook claims it for the British crown in 1769. They have naval bases in the Mediterranean. They have trading posts in India. Now, this is before the full British might of the 19th century, where they have complete control of Australia and massive holdings in Africa. After the Revolutionary War, Britain enters into what some historians have called the Second British Empire, where they have more direct control over things, and new technologies enables them to do that. But Britain has a lot on its plate, and America is only one theater of its operations and its politics and its warfare that's happening, if that makes sense of why they make the decisions that they do.
Okie doke. Good point. So, manpower. So we were just talking about how the British Army